unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Gary Rivlin, who is a journalist and writer. You've been published in a wide range of publications. And I remember Industry Standard way back in the day. Remember there was a proliferation of like a gazillion tech magazines, Wired and so forth, that were competing in the late 90s.
I love the Industry Standard, but the most amazing fact about the Industry Standard is in the year 2000, it set the U.S. record for most number of ad inches published by a magazine. Time magazine, right. Whatever, every magazine. It was number one. 8 months later, it went out of business. To me, it was the .com era, encapsulated. It was the most amazing thing, and everyone believed in it. And 8 months later, it was gone.
Well, the funny thing, of course, was that it had all these print ads, right? And it was all about the digital era, right? It's kind of remarkable. But you've also written a ton of books. I have a couple of them here. The most recent one, which brings you to town, brings you to on the book circuit, is this one, AI Valley: Microsoft, Google, and the $1 trillion race to cash in on artificial intelligence, which I see kind of as a sequel to Cade Metz's book in a way, because he discussed the early days of machine learning, and you're kind of catching things up. But you've also written a whole bunch of other books that I've acquired and read over the years, including this one, Broke USA, Saving Main Street, book on COVID. And then this one, Becoming a Venture Capitalist, a nice little shortcut book. And as far as I know, you haven't used any ChatGPT or other things to write any of this stuff. Is that right?
I've experimented with them all, but I use it as a research assistant. It's a great research assistant. You have to check that what they're producing is accurate. I find Claude, again, my preferred model. It's a great editor. I just feed it a chapter and said, I don't like this transition, help, just give me edit suggestions. And, I never cut and paste. Not like I just take what they say, but every once in a while, I was like, oh, that's a good idea. I hadn't thought of that. Or rewrite this paragraph 3 different ways, a paragraph I don't like. And that's how I want to do it. And then I, the human, do the work of it. But I find it a great assistant.
Well, what I like about this book, AI Valley, is I think of it as a long-term perspective. I mean, I don't want to make you sound old, but you are a veteran journalist, and, you wrote about the .com bubble, rise and fall. You wrote a book on Bill Gates. I mean, you were there in the thick of things back in the late 90s, and then you made a little bit of a detour into some other domains, and then came back to being a tech journalist. And so I think you're in a position better than some of the other people who have written about the current AI bubble or boom to kind of see the comparisons and see what's the same and what's different about the startup world, the VC world, and this new technology, which is, I think, and many think, as transformational as the internet.
Yeah, I agree with that. But it's not a coincidence. It was from mid 90s to 2000 covering the rise and fall of the .com boom. That's what drew me back. I mean, it was the end of 2022, and I saw the same thing happening, and that's what made me come back to tech. I just wanted to follow VCs and startups and the big companies all trying to cash in on this moment. I mean, that's the thing for venture capitalists, for the founders. It's this, how can we figure out how to create a company, fund a company to cash in on this moment? And of course, then you've got the big companies, Google, Microsoft, et cetera. They want to cash in on it too.
Well, I mean, it's funny because there are these parallels also where you talk about in the early 2000s, Google was seen as the bad guy, stomping out all innovation by doing all these acquisitions. And, Microsoft earlier was seen in the same position. And now there's this concern that it's the big guys that are going to wind up hoovering up all the benefits and the profit to be made from this new industry.
So I started this book thinking I'm just going to follow the startups, right?
Yeah.
What company is going to be the next Google, the next Facebook? And by the time I was finished, I realized that the next Google was probably going to be Google, and the next Facebook was going to be, man, this stuff is so expensive. When I started, it was, so at the start of 2023, you needed tens of millions of dollars, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars to train, fine tune, and run these models. by the end of 2024, you need billions, if not tens of billions. And how does a startup raise that kind of money? There are a couple that have. I mean, OpenAI just raised another $40 billion. Anthropic, I think, has raised about $20 billion. But they still have to raise more money because they're not profitable yet. And, they're looking at several years without profit. I worry that these really innovative startups that are doing incredible things are going to have to be gobbled up just to survive. I mean, the main company in my book had, they raised $1.5 billion. They had stars and Reid Hoffman, the co-founder of LinkedIn, Mustafa Suleyman, the co-founder of DeepMind in 2010, the first great machine learning, the first great AI startup. They had Bill Gates as a funder, Will.i.am, Ashton Kutcher. They had the star power. They had the money. They had everything. And in early 2024, they threw in the towel, and most of the staff went to Microsoft because the only way to see their vision, to build their version of a chatbot, which was different than most, was to do it inside a big company.
Yeah, I mean, you said that you were drawn to this story by a random email that you got from Reid Hoffman, and I guess when you started the book, you didn't know the ending. So, that's the difference between being a journalist and an historian, is that you're kind of reporting on current events. And it kind of reminded me of Michael Lewis's book a little bit. Remember when he was—
Which one?
He was writing the book on FTX.
Oh, right. Oh, my goodness. Yes, yes.
It sort of had a different ending from what he was expecting.
Yeah, this wasn't quite that dramatic, but in a way it was. I picked my 3 startups, the Reid Hoffman, Mustafa Suleyman one, which had large language models, a chatbot. But then I had another one, Runway, doing kind of text to video. Yeah. And then I had a third one, AI search, a company, a small startup by outsiders. It was ahead of everyone on AI search. But by the time I started writing, the other 2 fell by the wayside because Microsoft, Google, Meta, a few other giants had to be a big part of the story because they were catching up, and that was the way to tell the AI story to be accurate. So,
but I mean, the economies of scale in these foundation models has, yes, of course, given a leg up to the folks with capital, but it seems like it's easier and easier to raise enormous amounts of capital than it ever has been, right? If you're a startup.
Well, so I know the data. So in the mid 1990s, when I was seeing it, everyone was seeing it. You would say the venture capitalists were throwing money wildly at any company that had any reasonable plan for cashing in on the internet. Venture capital in 95, 96, it was under $10 billion a year. By 2021, it was $300 billion a year. There's, more than $100 billion a year, maybe $150 billion a year in the last couple of years being thrown in AI. So that was one of the big differences. There's lots of similarities between the dot-com era and the AI era.
And the check sizes are much, much bigger, right?
The check sizes are 5, sometimes 10 times bigger. But, not only that, just the number of venture capitalists, the number of investors, where there's a VC firm that monitors all this. They put it online. There's 5,000 AI angel investors. So that's 5,000 people. There's a lot of AI startups up there, but there's more people who want to invest in startups. And then you have like 3,000 or so early stage AI investors. That, I don't think when I was covering it, there were, 1,000 VCs all told.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing that hasn't changed, though, is that, the venture capitalists have no idea which companies are going to win. And so they're placing tons and tons of bets. I mean, I have VCs come and speak in my class. I had one come in yesterday, and, he was just outlining all of these dozens of different startups, agentic AI startups that they were investing in. And, he had absolutely no idea, which ones were more likely to win out.
It's interesting. So in the mid 1990s, I'd been much more of a politics reporter. I went to school as an engineer, or at least I started. So I had programmed early on in Fortran, basic early computer languages. So I was comfortable with what really drew me was exactly what you're talking about. They're just rolling the dice. They're just gambling. It's like, I'm going to put in back then, $2, $3, $5 million, and it's either going to be worth $1 billion or zero.
Right.
And I just love I've always been interested in gambling as a topic, and they're just a different version of the casino.
Right. I mean, you have to have a certain mindset. When you talk to these VCs, oftentimes they'll talk about their anti-portfolio, all the big ones that they missed out on. And, they don't seem to have a whole lot of, I don't know, regret. I mean, normal people would just, I don't know, I would lose so much sleep if I had the opportunity to invest, with Airbnb and said, these guys, they're not going to make it. I mean, I would destroy myself with counterfactuals.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that it's not the investments they made that blew up. Oh, well, we just blew $10 million. And, VCs are largely investing other people's money, which probably helps them sleep at night. So when they win big, they get their 20, 25, 30% cut, depending on which venture outfit we're talking about. But when they lose, it's not really their money for the most part. They put in a little bit typically. But the ones they obsess about are the ones that got away. Like Reid Hoffman, he became a venture capital in the late 2000s. His first investment was Airbnb, which made 1,000 times, 1,000x. He's amazing track record. He was the first money with a couple others in Facebook. His $37,500 was worth $400 million when they went public. But he talks about it. He had a chance to get into YouTube early, and he didn't. He had a chance to get into was it X or some company like that early. That's Twitter, the one that really bothers them.
Yeah. I mean, the thing that strikes me about these venture capitalists is that they come from a wide range of backgrounds, both in terms of what they study and what they did before. And what I was surprised by at a recent meeting of venture capitalists, how many of them were journalists. There were a bunch of journalists that have gone into venture capital.
Well, there's kind of two categories in my head of venture capitalists. There are, those who got an MBA and start as a junior VC. When they start as a junior VC, and work their way up if they're successful and they hope make a general partner. Then there are the operators. They co-founded a company that was successful. They're a top executive at a Twitter and Uber, and then they become a venture capitalist. That's like Reid Hoffman. But the journalist thing, maybe the greatest venture capitalist ever was a journalist of all things, Mike Moritz, who had worked at Time magazine. So maybe that's inspired. Though it's funny, I wrote a story for the New York Times in 2004, 2005 about the tourist VCs. Those who thought, this is easy. I want to get rich this way. And it's not as easy as it looks from the outside. And several of them were journalists, trade magazine folks who came in, thought they could do it, and just fell on their face.
But I mean, at the same time, as you have these huge economies of scale, everyone's talking about the one-person billion-dollar company, right? Everyone's talking about how these new tools, generative AI. I mean, this is it's like lean startup on steroids,
exactly.
Right? Like, so when the App Store was invented and when cloud was invented, you needed much less capital to do a startup. And now, if you've got AI on tap, you should be able to scale and build your business by just having like a whole army of assistants.
Right. So Reid Hoffman talks about AI as amplified intelligence, and this idea that it just gives you a superpower, that you can work much faster, you can do things. You could write a report in seconds. I think it's a little bit overstated. The one-person billion-dollar startup, I guess it's going to happen. I guess it's possible, but I think the more realistic way of thinking about that is you could have a couple of people found a company and they start to scale it without having to hire a lot of people. So, the company in the past that was 10 employees and wants to raise a big round of venture to become a 50 or 100 person company, I think it's going to be possible to remain a 10, 20 person company. But, AI isn't quite there yet. So you need marketing. You might not need 5 people for marketing, but you might want 1 or 2 humans. I mean, something to understand, I think that people don't get about AI is it's not like it's going to do it for you. It's your co-pilot. It's your assistant. It's a really powerful tool that you could use just like a computer or a calculator or a camera is a tool. It doesn't give you much unless you give it a lot. So the way I find it to be effective is I'm on a stream of consciousness. Here's what I want to do. Here's what I'm thinking about. Here's my idea. Here's how I want to frame it. And that's when I get a good answer. If, write a book about AI would be awful. But if I start giving it, quotations and describe characters and all that, it'll be something much richer. So getting back to the example, you still need a marketing person or 2. You still need salespeople. I don't think people are going to be persuaded by some bot saying, hey, will you buy our product? Here, sign up, $1 million contract for 3 years. There still needs to be humans in the loop. So I think we're going to need less people, not just, one-man bands.
Well, look, I mean, the book is a bit about technology and it's a bit of history, I guess, but I see it kind of as a book of sociology, right? Because I mean, you're describing how these people, they share ideas with each other, they share investment opportunities with each other, and it's kind of like a remarkably tight and connected network, right? So you describe, Altman's meeting with Hoffman and Hoffman's meeting with Musk, and they all get together at the Rosewood, whatever. And it seems that while the definition of Silicon Valley has expanded to include, San Francisco and perhaps a little dash of Redmond, at the end of the day, everybody's flocking back to the Valley. And, there was this attempt to found a company in London, right? DeepMind. But at the end of the day, most of the talent wound up moving here. I mean, what is it about Silicon Valley that just sucks in all the talent?
So DeepMind, by the way, this, as I described, the first great AI startup, it's still based in London. I mean, it's owned by Google, which is in Silicon Valley. You make a really good point that Silicon Valley is this sprawling place, but it seems kind of tiny, that the same people are investing in each other's company. And,
Peter Thiel is, he's got his fingers everywhere.
What is about it's like there's many great universities besides Stanford or Cal, Carnegie Mellon and Princeton and MIT, et cetera. I think what distinguishes Silicon Valley isn't the innovation. It's like a startup factory. This place is just built to hyperscale companies. If you're a really ambitious person and really have, that you're dreaming Google like billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar, these days maybe trillion-dollar dreams, you come here because of those 3,000 or 5,000 investors I mentioned before. A huge portion of them are here. Sand Hill Road is the Wall Street of technology. That's where a lot of the money is. That's where almost all the top venture capitalists are. There's like this little ecosystem of marketing people and lawyers who specialize in this. There's a reservoir of talent, right? You used to work at Google or Twitter, and now you start the company and you go get your engineers from there. There's also something inspiring. People kind of date it back to Social Network, the fictionalized movie about Zuckerberg and the founding of Facebook, that it just sort of made startups sexy. So there's almost like this pressure. I've heard people complain about it, that like, why haven't you done your startup yet? And there's it's just that kind of place where it's almost expected. Like, you're talented, let's co-found a company together.
Mm-hmm. Well, the term AI is something which is kind of elastic in its definition. And I think now we've kind of settled on this idea that whenever you're using the term AI, you're referring to, generative AI and large language models and so forth. But for people who are in the field, I mean, people who are in computer science or people who even teach things like data science and so forth, I mean, we've been using this term AI for forever, going back to Marvin Minsky, right?
I mean, artificial intelligence has been around since the 50s. People, if it wasn't very powerful, you really couldn't do much with it. But the thing that shocked me, that I loved, is like, I and virtually every person listening has been using AI
Yeah.
for a long, long time.
Yeah.
I mean, Google in the 2000s was using it, for search, like kind of for a garbled search query. They were using AI to make sense of it. That's how they were figuring out how to deliver up ads.
Yeah.
Mid 2010s, they started using Google Translate. Well, Google Translate is AI. It's not generative AI, but it's AI. Autocomplete, spam filters, recommendation engines. That's all AI. So AI has been part of our world. It was different in 2022, the end of 2022, when OpenAI released ChatGPT. It was a product that you can talk with, and like you could feel the AI. And so suddenly it was much more real. It wasn't, behind the glass. It was something that you could converse with.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about how Reid Hoffman sort of discovered AI, so to speak, or at least discovered this new wave of AI and realized that he needed to take it seriously. And I think, what was that, like 2015?
2015, yeah.
Yeah.
A dinner with somebody in the news occasionally, Elon Musk, who was an early investor in DeepMind and also a high-profile critic of artificial intelligence. So he was kind of playing both sides in that way. He and Hoffman had a dinner in Palo Alto in 2015, and Hoffman had gone to Stanford in the late 1980s and, kind of majored in artificial intelligence, this major called symbolic systems, which blended computer science with linguistics and other disciplines. And, he called it a toy. They were trying to teach it the difference between a dog and a cat. It's like a cat, a toddler kind of thing. And so, he wanted to have his impact on the world, and like, he wasn't going to make his impact that way. And it was this dinner with Musk where he was convinced, this is the moment. And he started talking to people 2015 after the Rosewood, which you mentioned before. Hoffman, along with Musk and others, Peter Thiel, were early investors in OpenAI. And then, a year or two later, Hoffman was a VC early investor in, back then it was autonomous vehicles, but he became an aggressive investor in artificial intelligence startups. And then in 2022, co-founded with Mustafa Suleiman, a third gentleman, a researcher, Inflection AI.
Yeah. And a lot of these founders are academics. And, I think here in the Valley, we kind of take that for granted. We think, oh yeah, no big deal. Most of my colleagues in the engineering school, they're professors and business people, founders or whatever. And I think when I talk to people from outside the US, they don't see being an academic as a plus. They see, like, to be a professor is to be so completely removed from the world of commerce. And yet, we've been doing it since the 1950s, with Fred Terman and so forth. But
I would say even earlier, Stanford in the 30s were encouraging their promising students. They have an idea. Hewlett-Packard, I think it was the late 1930s, kind of spun out basically from Stanford with the encouragement of the dean of engineering. It really was a departure.
Yeah. But today, I think it's kind of mainstream. It seems, fairly common.
Well, every university, or many, many, many universities across the country, have offices, technology offices.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, and they want to cut deals. Like, hey, you developed technology here, we'll help you, but we want our little piece of it. Google.
Yeah, but the traditional model was for technology transfer was that the university develops the intellectual property in the lab, and then they sell it to the, to those business people who know what to do with it, right? But now, at the technology transfer office, we encourage the professors to take time off and spend half time doing their businesses and whatever. And I think I don't think that trend is going to slow down. If anything, I think it's going to accelerate.
Well, it's inspiring when you see some professor. You could say it's about the money, and of course it's largely about the money, but it's also about, like, you're working on something and then you give it to the world, and it must be magic to see your product being used by thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people. There's a professor at Stanford I quote several times, a number of times in the book, Chris Manning, who said, on most campuses, or at least in the humanities, the academics are boasting about, I had this paper published, I had that published on Stanford's campus. It's like, I did this startup, I invested in that startup, because they're also investing. And they have promising students with a great idea, and they put a little bit of money into it. You even see professors here at Cal and at Stanford, and I'm sure other schools, kind of going in on creating their own venture outfit.
Yeah, Chris has a fund, right?
Right.
Along with Peter Abil here in Berkeley. And what's really wonderful about the Chris Manning story, is that, he was also sort of a skeptic initially.
Well, there was this departure that dates back to the 50s, 60s between, machine learning, these neural networks that instead of hard coding them line by line, let's create a model and point it at something. We'll train it on books, articles, social media, the open web, whatever, and it learns and it finds it like a human. The idea was to mimic the brain, but for a long time that was poo-pooed. And Chris Manning and most everyone in the field was doing what I call rules-based. This idea that you have to teach the computer line by line by line, or create these very complicated statistical models and train them in a more they're more predictable. I mean, the big criticism about neural networks is the black box problem. Like, even the creators don't know quite why they say what they do.
Well, I think it's probably a good thing that we have people with that background, because I think most of the tools that we're using now, they seem to lean on both traditions, right? So if we look at, the guardrails that we have for all of these things, I mean, those are effectively rules-based systems oftentimes.
Right. So, it's a multi-step process creating one of these large language models, or, it could be for video or images, that you train it. But then really the hard work is the fine tuning it, giving it the rules. Like, the big thing now is I have to teach these things. If you don't know the answer, say, I don't know. They're weirdly people pleasers, right? They just want to, they asked a question, so I need to give an answer. Or maybe it's just a mirror on us. They're trained on our material. And, people who write things are know-it-alls. And so the model became know-it-all. So that's some of what you're talking about. They have to teach it the rules. Like, they had to teach it how to have back and forth. That's a learned trait that you had to teach these models.
Yeah. And of course, the startup that you spent most time on was, Pi was the product. Actually, I never used this. And after reading the book, I downloaded it to see what it's like. But these are conversational, and they're used not just to solicit information, but also to get advice, and not just advice about professional matters, but advice about, personal life and so forth, right? So, I mean, the AIs of the future are going to be our companions, our friends, our advisors, consultants,
our romantic partners.
Yeah, right.
No, I mean, you laugh, I could laugh, but 10 years from now, I think it's gonna be commonplace that people have romantic relationships, with a bot. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. So there does seem to be, in the background, there are all of these doomsayers, I guess, people who are concerned about the paperclip problem or whatever. And what's surprising to me is how many of them are actually in the industry, right? So normally you would think that you'd have the techno optimists who are building product, and then you have the techno pessimists maybe over in Washington or in the think tanks. But it seems like throughout the industry, you've got people on both sides. Got a bunch of people in the industry who are saying, let's do a pause, let's slow down. But then, of course, no one does.
Right. Yeah. So the terms, I'll use Reid Hoffman's terms. There's the doomers, which you've been describing as those, like, I'm not a doomer, so I'm going to mock it a little bit, that, kind of this Hollywood inspired, the laser-eyed robots are going to subjugate humanity, and we're all going to be working for them until we go to the future and get someone to destroy the machine, kind of thing. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum are the zoomers, which you call the accelerationists, they're commonly called, and they're full speed ahead. Sometimes, China is invoked. We can't have any guardrails. Nothing should be slowing us down. Government, the universities should just be doing everything they can to help accelerate. And there's kind of something in the middle where I personally put myself, Reid Hoffman would put himself, which are the bloomers, that I think AI could do extraordinary things around medicine, around science, around education, if we're deliberate about it. A powerful tool for good is also a powerful tool for bad. And, many people have lots of concerns. I'm not a doomer, but, AI, the use of AI weaponry, using AI for surveillance, these things reflect the biases we have. So using AI to predict, to determine someone's sentence, whether or not we interview them for a job or not, that scares me. Autonomous AI. People believe in this thing. Again, I'm just going to repeat something I just said. Right now, at least, and for the foreseeable future, it's an assistant. There always has to be a human in the loop. If you're a creator, it's the human who's creating. It's not like, make me, type in, make me a Steven Spielberg film. The human has to say, here's the concepts, here's the main characters, here's the plot, here's how, I see it ending. And, so you really need a human in the loop, whether it's, overseeing our water system. Because, these things like, there's another term for AI or another use of AI that it's alien intelligence. Because these things like, no human could have the depth of knowledge that one of these models already has, just across the board. Is astonishing. But on the other hand, it has no sense. It has no common sense. It doesn't understand basic physics. If I take this cup and put it on the edge of the table, it's going to fall kind of thing. I mean, one of my favorite questions is this, is AI hyped or overhyped? Yeah. My answer is yes. I mean, clearly, this 2025 is supposed to be the year of the agent. We're all going to be using personal agents who, know like, oh, Gary likes aisle seats. And when he goes to San Francisco, he wants a hotel near a bar, and really gets to know me as my personal assistant, just like wealthy people, famous people have personal assistants. Hey, buy my friend a present and have a sense of what that friend would have. But right now, these models, as extraordinary as they are, it can feel like sorcery and magic. They don't have any long-term memory. They don't have memory session to session to session.
I love these people who have the virtual boyfriends and girlfriends, right? When they max out their context window and then they reboot their boyfriend, they gotta train them all over again.
It's 50 first dates. And so
but that kind of actually is kind of like a real boyfriend, right? It's like
a bad boyfriend
or a girlfriend,
But I mean, what's really going on, I think, is these companies have raised, millions, tens of millions, in some cases billions, and they have to justify these huge valuations. Right now, OpenAI on paper is worth about $300 billion. Go to the Fortune 500 list. That's in the top 100, and it's worth more than Chevron or companies have been around forever. It's a real business. I mean, brought in $3.5 billion or so last year. It lost $5 billion because it's really expensive to hire talent and even more expensive to operate these things, to train them, to operate them. They take up a lot of energy. They take up a ton of money. But I think to justify the investment, to justify these inflated valuations, you have to promise the future sooner than it's going to come. So that gets to the way this is underhyped. I mean, I saw this happening with the internet. We tend to overstate the short term in a new technology and understate the long term. And so all of the promises of the internet came true, but not fast enough for everyone to cash in a year or two. 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, the internet's at the center of everything. It's changed business, it's changed humans. It's, at the center of our lives. Mobile, the center of our lives. I'm convinced that artificial intelligence, not next year, maybe not the year or two after that, but 10 or 15 years, I think that's the safest bet in the world, that this is going to be the center of everything.
Yeah, I remember, I think it was in 1996. I remember I was in law school and I was watching the TV in the coffee lounge or whatever. And I forget who it was. He's that famous journalist who said that Amazon was going to hit $400 a share,
Henry Blodgett?
Yeah, Henry Blodgett. And everybody ridiculed him. And of course, it did wind up crashing and burning back below 400. But I mean, heck, 400 was a lowball estimate compared to, what it's worth now.
I remember doing a story in the mid 2000s. This venture capitalist put in, I think it was $4 million into the Facebook. It was only on colleges that it was called the Facebook.com. And, at $100 million valuation, VCs up and down Sand Hill Road were mocking him.
Yeah.
$100 million, it's, $1.5 trillion or so, today. I mean, well, maybe not today.
Who knows what it is today. Right. But you also see now people writing checks for, one-page idea statements. And some people would say that is the mark of a bubble. I mean, bubble could be good or bad. I think you quote someone who says that Silicon Valley is all about bubbles, and bubbles are features, not bugs.
Well, so I was quoting Paul Sappho, the forecaster, who's been in Silicon Valley since the early 1980s, and I love his concept that the perfect Silicon Valley is like bubbles in seltzer. There's always little bubbles. What you really want to avoid are huge bubbles, which go pop and cause a lot of pain, like the .com bubble. But crypto, maybe it's going to come back. NFTs. Fintechs were the hot thing until they weren't the hot thing. They're going to come back. So that's Silicon Valley, and so a lot of people are going to lose a lot of money on AI, but a lot of people are going to make a lot of money on AI. Just you were lucky enough or smart enough to make the right bets. But again, that's just, to me, the nature of the beast. That's when you are trying to create companies that are, basically go big or go home. You could be too early. You could be a little bit too late. It's really kind of this risky thing, but that's what a venture capitalist is. That's what these entrepreneurs are. They're just major risk takers.
Now, getting back to where we started, I mean, a big part of the book is about how these sort of independent lone entrepreneurs ultimately wind up getting absorbed into the belly of the beast, right? So
that's what I mean. Yeah. Most companies that don't go out of business end up being acquired by a large company.
And so the question is, what's so wrong with that? I mean, it seems like a lot of the founders, they're ambivalent about it. I mean, they like the big checks, they like having the capital, but they seem to chafe at their new roles inside these companies. And I guess people are also concerned about maybe the enshittification of the product. I mean, is it that when you lose autonomy, you lose control over the vision or the dream that you have, the use to which you want to put the tech?
Well, I mean, there's many examples of that you are bought by a bigger company and they ruin it. You're quoting Cory Doctorow. I love that term, enshittification. That, one of his prime examples is Google. They started off as a pure thing. In fact, the original statement by the two Google founders was, we're not going to have any advertising because it's going to ruin the thing. Yeah. Now it's been enshittified or whatever, however you would construct that. So, it's complicated what you're talking about. Sometimes, people are big dreamers. The best entrepreneurs dream big, and their idea was never to go work for another company. Some people are just built that way. They don't want to work for a big company. There's some people, though, I'm friendly with one founder. I think he's founded 8 or 9 companies now. And that's just his thing. He just loves starting them, gets people together and has all this promise. Some work, some don't work. I think he's like 4 or 5 for 8. And then, they sell and, he might go work if Google bought it at Google for 6 months. But that time period is really about him figuring out, what do I want to create next? Because that's just who he is and what he wants to do. Some people, Reid Hoffman included, they don't want to work for big companies. That's just who they are. Or maybe they have enough independence that they don't have to work for a big company, right? If you're selling to a big company, you're getting a big check. So you're now financially independent. And so, I don't know if I can say it, you have FU money.
Yeah.
You don't want to work for the man. You don't have to work for the man. You can just go start your own thing.
Yeah. But a lot of these companies have I think some of them have tried to figure out how to keep some autonomy in place to keep these folks happy because they need to keep them around. So, Mustafa Suleyman, who is features throughout the book. I mean, he's now working inside of Microsoft, and Microsoft has to figure out a way to keep him around, right?
I mean, it's interesting. So, Microsoft, which I happened to write a book in the late '90s about them, and they're an amazing company.
They were easy to beat up in the early 2000s. I mean,
but they were just a big dumb giant. They just were stumbling, and they would make a lot of money, but it was perceived that they wouldn't be innovators anymore. In 2014, Satya Nadella took over as CEO. Since he took over, the stock has gone up in 10 years by 10x.
Well, maybe not after today.
Okay.
It's down to 9. I don't know. I haven't checked.
Okay. So 8x is still amazing, or whatever it might be. I mean, especially for a company that big. I mean, going 8 or 10x with a smaller thing, I mean, it's math, the law of big numbers. But anyway, some of what the secret for Nadella is he's done that so well. You brought up, Inflection, where most of the employees in Inflection went to Microsoft, including Mustafa Suleyman, who's now the CEO inside of Microsoft of their consumer AI division. And what they're great at, and a better example might be, or a different kind of example might be OpenAI. They in 2019 put $1 billion into OpenAI, again, the company behind ChatGPT and other AI products, generative AI products. And they put in 2023 another $10 billion. They keep on investing. And, the old Microsoft, or the model among large companies is we need to own these things. But instead, let's own a big percentage of it. They're partners. They give us exclusive, all of that kind of thing. And then you look at something like they did with Inflection, but also other companies that they bought. They let them stay independent. I mean, if Google let DeepMind operate in London. Mustafa Suleyman is still here in Silicon Valley, even though Microsoft is based in Redmond. So they give them some independence. In fact, Satya Nadella came down and addressed the entire Inflection company when Suleyman announced the deal. And, someone raised their hand who had worked at Microsoft and didn't like working at Microsoft, so went to a startup. And we don't really want to do the Microsoft way. And he said, no, you don't understand. It's up to you to change Microsoft. And I think that's really the right mindset. We're spending so much money for this company. Let's learn. Let's let them be them, and maybe we'll even learn from them. And all, as opposed to being arrogant or static and just saying, well, we know it all. We have a lot of money, so you will now conform and be part of the Borg or whatever. So
now you reported on the OpenAI soap opera, right? with Sam Altman. I mean, it's hard for me to think of a similar situation that had ever happened quite like that one. I mean, we know how, Travis Kalanick got kicked out of Uber, but, he didn't, he didn't threaten to take all the employees with him, and he certainly wasn't invited back. It's very, very bizarre situation.
Well, he didn't, Sam Altman didn't really threatened to take all the employees with him when he was pushed overboard.
Right. The employees.
Almost 99, it was 700 out of 720, some crazy number like that, signed a petition or signed whatever saying, if you don't return him to OpenAI, we're leaving, which means the company's worthless, right? I mean,
yeah.
A company like that, it's the people, it's the talent that makes it worth a lot of money. I agree with you. I mean, God, I mean, it's not quite the Kennedy assassination. Where were you? But I remember exactly what I was doing, exactly when I learned, because it floored me. It floored me. They were the premier. They still are the premier AI startup. Altman, I have mixed feelings about him, but he's just extraordinary at what he does. But, what's that expression, hoisted on your own petard or something like that? So OpenAI started in 2015 as a nonprofit. And it was kind of this beautiful idea. They didn't like that Google had bought DeepMind, and then, oh my goodness, that, AI is going to be in the hands of a giant. So it was let's create kind of the anti-corporate company, and we're going to put safety before profits. And well, this stuff's expensive, and you might be able to raise tens of millions of dollars for a nonprofit. So they created this cockamamie like nonprofit that's overseeing, a for-profit subsidiary. And so the nonprofit board of OpenAI, which had both eyes on AI safety, they didn't like what they were seeing. And, it wasn't just them. In 2021, a group of 7 top engineers left OpenAI to found Anthropic because they thought safety was taking a back seat, to competition and winning and profits. We've seen the last year or two a parade of people leaving OpenAI, complaining that it's about winning and shiny toys and no longer about trust and safety. And so the board, without much, the difference with Uber was there was drama. The board was getting on Travis's case, like, please, come on. And it kind of built to a head. This was like, Altman, it's such a, like, the life of the fabulous that we're very unaware of the rest of us. He's in Las Vegas for the Las Vegas Grand Prix, where, Shaquille O'Neal and, other famous people, Beyonce maybe, I forget the list of famous people who were there for that. And he logs onto his computer at 9 a.m. He's going to have a routine call, and suddenly pops up on his Zoom or whatever, was all the independent members of the board, and they just read a statement, you're fired. And he was in shock. The rest of the world was in shock. At first, he said, like, well, okay, I believe and love OpenAI. Is one of the co-founders, kind of the moving force behind the company. But then, I want to fight back, and the employees joined him. Even Ilya Sutskever, who is kind of the leader of the coup, top employee, and again, an early employee co-founder of OpenAI. He was on the board, and he voted with the independents, and he was the swing vote and all. Even he, within 24, 48 hours, flipped to the other side. I regret what I did. I mean, they would part once Altman was brought back, but it lasted 5 days. It was like an amazing drama that was playing out in front of us. On Twitter. It wasn't X then, I'm calling it by the right name, on Twitter, and there was great reporting all around with just, because no one could understand what happens. And, Satya Nadella, they put $13 billion into this thing. Microsoft's AI strategy was, based so much on OpenAI. The rest of the world, the analysts, the reporters were all complimenting Microsoft Nadella for being so brilliant, for making this deal with OpenAI. And then suddenly it looked like this thing could be worth nothing. In fact, they were trying to raise some money so other employees could cash out a little bit. And I think it was worth the valuation then was like $87-90 billion. And it was this extraordinary thing that's only in Silicon Valley. Like, this thing that investors are saying is worth $90 billion could have been worth zero.
Yeah, no, you're only valuable if you have your people, right? But the other thing that I think is new is the degree to which Silicon Valley is participating in politics. I mean, if you go back to the 90s, Microsoft didn't even have a single lobbyist.
They look down at politicians. Yeah. They look down at DC.
Well, they just thought it's irrelevant to us. Technology does its thing and DC does its thing. And now, right, I mean, it's a big part of what's going on in politics. I mean, I think a lot of people thought that Trump has said all these terrible things about big tech companies, being biased, and he's going to crack down on them as if, Washington is going to rule over Silicon Valley. But it seems like Silicon Valley is maybe ruling over Washington to some degree. I mean, today, and I read in the news that, Sam Altman got like a waiver of intellectual property.
Oh, he won that.
Yeah. So
just so people understand, because this is, I mean, I'm a creator. I actually went and checked that all 11 of my books have been read by Llama, which is Meta's open source model. And so OpenAI, a couple other companies, Meta, petitioned the Trump administration invited public comment. Anyone could give comment about how should we win? How should the U.S. win in AI? Give us suggestions. And what OpenAI and Meta and other companies said is like, give us fair use of copyrighted material. Let us use it without permission and without having to pay. And, that's a really big deal. That's the stuff that's working its way through the courts. And so if that happens, I mean, we're getting at, something like, why suddenly did, all these people, Mark Andreessen and Elon Musk, they gave money in 2020 to Joe Biden. Why'd they move right so fast? I think it's so easy. The Biden administration had a very harsh set of policies towards crypto. And Mark Andreessen's firm, Andreessen Horowitz, I think they have investments in like 100 crypto. They have like a $7.5 billion worth of money set aside to invest in crypto. The Trump administration comes in and, poof, all of that, all the regulations, all the resistance to crypto went away. And so now suddenly they could make the money they want to make. The same on AI. The Biden administration, they put in, I thought, very gentle, very sensible guidelines. For instance, they required those working on these cutting edge, larger models to red team them, to enlist a outside group to try to break, to try to can they expose problems before these products are released, and required the companies to share that information with the government. Again, within days, maybe hours of Trump taking over as president, they went poof. And so they want to make a lot of money. The government just stood aside on crypto and artificial intelligence, were sort of two of the biggest ways that Silicon Valley, wants to make money.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, one other question I have for you is, do you think that if we look at these trends in AI, I mean, there's a big debate over the extent to which it is going to do all the great stuff, like alleviate poverty and solve world hunger, that sort of stuff.
Climate change. It's going to solve climate change.
Right. I mean, is this the kind of hype that we heard around crypto, sort of a marketing campaign?
To me, it resonates with the internet. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, the compare contrast to the mid 1990s and the rise in the internet, and the last couple of years with AI. It's just these overinflated claims. Back then, like, oh, the internet's going to bring the world together, and we're going to have peace, or we're going to have like all this great knowledge. I mean, there's some truth to the great knowledge thing, but it was very pie in the sky. And I'm thinking the same thing now. Again, I tend to be optimistic that if we're deliberate about it, if we're smart about it, this could be, provide extraordinary things. But no, it's not going to, close the gap between the developed world and the developing world, as some people say. Like, going back to your point before, if this is powerful tool where, a one-person startup, like, well, it means anyone, anywhere, if they're smart and have a good idea, can succeed at, it'd be truth. I think it can help. Perhaps, kind of help the developing world catch up. But it's not going to solve any of the problems that people say it's going to solve. Again, this thing's just a mirror. Right now, this thing is just a mirror of who we are. And, it could help on education. There's a study I love around education, just to get specific about one. It's out of Nigeria. And it wasn't just kids with their AI tutor. It was teachers using AI tutors. And I think that's really key. And they had a group of kids work with the teachers using AI. In 6 weeks, they had 2 years of advancement. Because, like, I don't know from Nigerian schools, but here in the US, public schools will have 30 kids per class with one teacher. And like, how do they know where each kid doesn't quite understand what AI could figure that out. AI could start delivering the kind of information, the kind of tests to help them understand it. And so it really is kind of this extraordinary tool. It could also be a tool, like I caught my kid using it to do his 10th grade composition. Within 3 sentences of reading it, it was obviously it used AI. So, again, it could tool for good, is tool for bad and stuff. But I really do have a lot of promise.
Well, when I think about professions like medical, these guys obviously are threatened. If you go to most of these models and start asking medical questions, they'll typically say, consult with your doctor. It's like, no, look, if I could do that so easily, I wouldn't be asking you this question, right? They give me like an appointment in a month, right? I want to know the answer now. So, it seems like at least in the area of medicine, giving everybody on the planet access to cutting edge medical information would be,
Here's a data point for you. There's, roughly 1 billion people on this planet who have easy access to medical care. There's 5 billion people on this planet who have a smartphone.
And are you including the people here in the U.S. as having easy access? Because that's not that easy. You got to get through the gatekeepers if you want.
Fair enough. Relatively easy access. Yeah. And so 5 billion people. Would it be preferable that they see a doctor, see a nurse practitioner, whatever, an expert, professional? I mean, yes. But perfect shouldn't be our goal. If you're out in rural area, you don't have access, show it that rash and like, oh, don't worry, that's a garden variety thing. Like, get to a city right now because this is life threatening. Just get basic advice, for a pregnant woman. Here's the things you should, think about and do and how you have to change your life kind of thing. But beyond that, like, treatments, vaccines, therapies, all of that kind of stuff. It's accuracy reading, diagnostics, like mammograms. Like, human doctors have like 93, 94% accuracy at detecting a cancer. These models more like 99, 98, 99%. So my ideal scenario is you have the doctor and you have the AI as the backstop and you can catch some things, so across, rare eye disease, an experienced doctor might have seen, dozens, couple hundred cases of a rare eye disease. Well, these models are trained on every example they could have access to. It could be millions. And so, they're better trained than a human because a human can't possibly, see all the examples.
Yeah, my favorite story in the book is when these researchers were just playing around with ChatGPT, and all of a sudden it started doing stuff that they didn't quite understand, which was kind of wild.
It taught itself how to code.
Yeah, and they were like, "Wait, how did that happen?"
And Google had an example of it learning a foreign language they didn't tell it to learn. It's sort of like the kid who kind of like pulls the encyclopedia in the old days, pulled the encyclopedia off the shelf and it starts reading about it. Like, I guess these things are curious. I mean, it's so fascinating to see some of the things these models do. They could lie. Yeah. Another famous example, I think, is when GPT-4 came out and OpenAI was open about this. One of their researchers found an example of it going out to something like Fiverr, I can't remember what it was, to hire a human to break the CAPTCHA test, which is trying to prevent a machine from doing this. I had this person.
And then lying. Lying to the Mechanical Turk person that they hired. Say, oh no, I'm not a robot. I'm a blind person.
They're duplicitous, right? Again, they've learned very well from human beings.
Right. So final question, I guess, or observation. I've noticed here in San Francisco that the doom and gloom that we had as a city, as a region a couple of years ago is kind of abated. It wasn't that long ago when people were talking about San Francisco as I don't know, they had some term for it.
Doom loop.
Yeah, doom loop. And now it seems like people want to live in San Francisco again. There's an excitement around being back in this area, and all the folks who went to Austin are coming back.
Right. Actually, I have somebody in the book who fled in 2022 because there was no sense of community, there's no sense of excitement. And then ChatGPT comes out and suddenly there's events all the time, and it's like every night there's get together. Tonight it's
impossible to keep up, right?
Tonight I'm speaking at some event that is a cerebral valley, that's the new term in San Francisco. I mean, if you've been in San Francisco has problems with vacant storefronts, there are, commercial real estate, a homelessness problem. It's hardly been solved, but there is an excitement in the tech world. Clearly, there's companies are flocking, founders are flocking. That's another parallel with the .com era. Just like suddenly you had people from around the country, around the world coming there because they want to be part of this exciting thing. And that's happening again with AI in the last couple of years.
Well, it's definitely exciting times to be here, and it's exciting times if you're in any kind of tech industry, particularly in the AI space, and it's probably exciting times to be a tech journalist.
This was such a fun book to write, just to spend a couple of years on the front lines and kind of getting war stories, following people trying to cash in on this thing. It was really kind of a pleasure to come back. It was exciting for me too, to your point.
Well, thanks, Gary. hopefully we'll talk again with the next book.
Great. My pleasure. Thanks so much.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.